All right, good evening, everyone. I think we'll get started here. I just have a quick introduction. I recognize almost all of the names here, so that's always kind of fun. It's nice to see you on Zoom, even if we don't get to see you in person. We're hoping that one day we will be back together again soon. We will be. But for now, we have this presentation on Ring Lardner. When Molly and I, and of course, Molly Watson needs no introduction. She's our assistant director at the museum and the mansion. Molly mentioned that, doing a Zoom program for Ring Lardner is actually works well because there's a lot of newspaper clippings about him. There's a lot of text involved. And when you're in a big room and you're looking at a screen, it's kind of hard to read all of those things. And being here, with us on the computer, she's able to zoom in and show you some things that might be hard to see or difficult to kind of, pick through when you're doing this on a bigger screen. So we've got a nice small group here on the big screen. Thank goodness for technology, right? So I'm just going to turn it over to her and let her get started on teaching us about Ring Lardner, literary hero of Niles. Molly, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, and welcome everybody. As Christina was saying, I'm the assistant director at the Niles History Center, and so it's interesting because we get a lot of visitors that come into the museum, and a lot of people like to talk about famous individuals from Niles. Like they always want to talk about Montgomery Ward, who we knew grew up there, or the Dodge brothers, of course, who were born in the Niles area, or even Tommy James from Tommy James and the Shondells. Like we hear about them all the time, but less so we hear people talk about Ring Lardner. And we even have exhibits at the museum. And I don't know how many times I've had people look at the exhibits and were told by visitors that they didn't have any idea who Ring Lardner was. I would argue, however, that he's probably one of the most famous people to come from Niles, especially in his era. He was extremely famous and well known. Ring Lardner was a sports journalist, and he was a writer of short stories, novels, songs, and plays. During the early 1900s through the 1930s, he was an extremely popular author in the US. I think it's safe to say he was a household name at that time. He used a certain vernacular that was very of the era, and he wrote a lot of satire and humor, poking fun at various topics. He's most known for his writings on sports, particularly baseball. Just to show a little bit about his popularity at the time, in the J.D. Salinger's novel Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield, the main character, says, "My favorite author is my brother DB, and my second favorite is Ring Lardner." It is said that Ernest Hemingway wrote for his high school newspaper under the pseudonym Ring Lardner Jr. It's also said that F. Scott Fitzgerald used Lardner as an inspiration for his character Abe North in the book Tender is the Night. We know Lardner and Fitzgerald were friends, and they actually lived next door to each other at one time. We'll talk about that a little later. Virginia Woolf even commented on how much she liked one of Lardner's characters, Jack Keith. She appreciated the use of the American language in his Busher stories that we're going to talk about too. This evening, we will be discussing Ring Lardner's illustrious career and his family's connection to the Niles area. Ringgold William Ring Lardner was born in Niles on March 6, 1885. His parents were Henry and Lena B. Phillips. That was her maiden name. There they are there. In Niles, the Lardners were a more prominent family. They also have a lasting legacy in the community. The family home is still standing on Bond Street. And for Ring Lardner, the local middle school in town is named after him. A little background on his parents. Henry Lardner was born near Niles in 1839. His father, who was also Henry, gave up a law business in Pennsylvania to move to the area, and he established a home along the Dowagiac and Kinsey Creeks, and he operated a carding mill there. A couple months after Henry's Jr.'s birth, his mother died. An aunt came to the area to take care of him for a while, and he eventually took him back east to be educated. As a young man, Henry had started to work in the parent office of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company, but he left the business to be a farmer in 1858, and he returned to Niles and he took over the family farm. His mother, Ring's mother, Lena Phillips, was born in New York on June 2nd, 1843, to parents Reverend Joseph Phillips and Eliza Thompson. In the 1850s, the Phillips family moved to Niles, where Reverend Joseph was rector of Trinity Episcopal Church. As many of you probably know, Trinity Episcopal is still standing today. It's still an active church in the community. So there's a historic picture of it. Ring apparently played the organ at the church from time to time. He also sang in the choir. Lena married Henry Lardner at this church on November 6, 1861. I'd like to take a moment to talk about Lena B. Phillips Lardner a little more, because I really feel like her life and accomplishments and talents had a direct effect on her children, including, of course, Ring. We know she taught at the public schools in Niles. She also taught Sunday school at Trinity, and she directed music at the church. She was very talented in music and in writing. She wrote and published 2 books of verse and prose. One was called Sparks from the Yule Log, and the other is This Spray of Western Pine. She often contributed to the famous column in the Chicago Tribune called A Line, a Type, or Two. And in addition, she was known to perform a great number of writing tasks for the community. It was said that like anyone could come to her if they needed a class poem, an oration, an obituary, or even an essay, and she would help them with their writing. You can see here, this is a South Bend Tribune article from December 16th, 1909, and it mentions in here, it's talking about the holiday edition of the paper, and it says that there's going to be a collection of poems by Mrs. Lardner of Niles featured in this paper. We know Mrs. Lardner was heavily involved in music, and she taught lessons to her children. She also encouraged them to participate in the arts, music, plays, of course, etc. She had 9 children, but only 6 survived. Those were William, Henry III, Lena, Reginald or Rex, Anna, and Ringgold or Ring. This picture shows several of the Lardner children with their mom outside the family home. As I mentioned, Ring was born March 6, 1885. As a young boy, the family moved into a large home on Bond Street that overlooked the St. Joseph River. We know Ring was interested in sports as a young child, especially baseball, which I think is perfectly evidenced in that picture there where he's holding the baseball bat. We know baseball is something else that'll come into play during his writing career. He also sang music, or played music, sang in the church choir, and did a number of other activities. The picture, oops, there's the Lardner home, a couple postcards in the Niles History Center collection that we have of it. The Gothic Revival home was originally built by a local banker, Rodney Payne, and it featured a large veranda, 14 rooms, including a large living room with a pipe organ. The grounds featured a carriage house, tennis courts, toboggan slide, all for the kids to use growing up. The Lardner family kept the home until the early 1930s. As I said, it's still standing in Niles today, and it's privately owned now. But we have a couple pictures in our collection at the museum that show, like on the left, those are the parents outside the family home, and then some of the children at the home too. The young girl in the picture is, according to the back, the identification on the back of the photos was possibly a neighbor child, not one of the Lardner children. We know Ring Lardner's education started at home through a tutor and his mother, but eventually he went to the Niles public schools. He graduated from Niles High School in 1901 at the age of 16. He apparently authored the class poem that year, which is an early writing nod for him. So on the left is a picture of Ring Lardner with some of his classmates. And another person in his class, or at least graduated really close to him, was Oral Coolidge, and she ended up being the first librarian at Niles. And then on the right, it shows what would have been Niles High School, was the Union School when Ring Lardner attended. This other picture, it's dated 1900, so it would have been a year before Ring Lardner graduated, but you can get kind of an idea of what some of the grounds of what the school would have looked like at that time. Ring wrote about his childhood and his education quite often later in life. He tended to make jokes about it, which was, of course, his writing style, but he seems to have enjoyed it. After graduating from high school, he worked a series of jobs in Chicago and locally. None of them really panned out. In 1902, his father even sent him to the Armour Institute of Technology in Chicago to study mechanical engineering, but he left after only one term. When he came back to Niles, he worked another series of jobs before starting at the Niles Gas Company in 1904. This is really his first steady employment. According to Jonathan Yardley, who wrote one of the biographies of Ring Lardner, they said he worked as a combo meter reader, bookkeeper, bill collector, office boy, and floor mopper. There's also an excerpt in that book that Lardner wrote about his time with the Niles Gas Company. I included it here. It's very of his writing style. He said, the making out of bills and the keeping of books came under the head of hard labor. The mopping was a kind of game. I used to see whether I could do it today faster than I had done it yesterday. Trying to collect bad debts and get new customers was a setup. I have always been a person who could take no for an answer. Reading meters was the rub, because meters are usually in dark cellars, where my favorite animal, the rat, is wont to dwell. When I entered a cellar and saw a rat reading the meter ahead of me, I accepted his reading and went on to the next house. Lardner started his work with newspapers at the local Niles Daily Sun. According to an article from the Niles Daily Star in 1961, Ring's brother Rex worked at the Daily Sun at the time, and he submitted some of Ring's pieces to the paper where they were printed. So we have our historic picture on the left of the Niles Daily Sun building, or the Reddick building, and then a picture of it just today in case you didn't know where it was. It's on Front Street, really close to where it intersects with Main Street, and the building is still standing today. In 1905, we know that Lardner took a job writing for the South Bend News-Times. There's actually a little bit of lore as to how he obtained that job. It's said that Ring's brother Rex was writing for the South Bend Tribune at the time. He apparently worked for a number of the papers in the area, and the city's competitor paper, the News-Times, sent someone to Niles to speak to Rex about a job. When they got to the house, Ring answered the door. He told the guy that he often helped his brother and would be willing to work for them. This was apparently a slight lie on his part, but he got the gig anyway. Ring told a version of the story later in life, so I believe there must be some kernel of truth in that. When he got the job at the South Bend News-Times, he was able to cover sports, a start that would be quite the career in this part of the newspaper world. He covered baseball, but also other athletics, including football, boxing, and even horse racing. He would cover Notre Dame games and high school athletics too. He also had to cover local events, among other things. These are a couple articles from the South Bend Tribune. One was from 1910, noting when Ring Lardner was leaving the Chicago Tribune, but it mentions that he was a former, he worked for the News-Times. And then this other article is from 1929, and it actually notes that at one time Ring Lardner worked for the South Bend Tribune as well. It's important to note that it's kind of hard to track some of Lardner's early reporting in South Bend area, because the paper did not always include bylines. But luckily his writing style is so unique that they've been able to identify some that they're certain it had to be done by Ring. In 1907, he moved to Chicago and he joined the staff of the Chicago Inter-Ocean. In a year later, he wrote his first piece on Major League Baseball. It was about the Cubs. He worked for a number of papers in Chicago, including the Inter-Ocean, the Examiner, and then eventually the Chicago Tribune. He's covered sports, a lot of baseball, particularly the Cubs and the White Sox, of course, but he also covered some other teams too. In 1910, he left Chicago. He took a job for the Sporting News in St. Louis, and then later he left that to take a job with the Boston American. So at this point, you can kind of see his writing is being read in larger circles. He's no longer just reporting for just Michiana area or the Chicago area. He's becoming more well-known. He was also becoming popular for his reputation as a clever, humorous, and witty baseball writer. One of the best at the time, people said. He wrote with that vernacular that was very of the time, and it really resonated with people. He used a lot of the common language of the day. In 1913, he returned to the Chicago Tribune, and he took over the column called In the Wake of the News. With this column, he was able to report on sports, national events, and his own musings, and even more. So this is probably one of the most famous pictures of Ring Lardner. I always see this one. And it's supposed to be taken around 1913 when he was working at the Chicago Tribune. According to an author who wrote a 1956 biography of Lardner, the author's name was Donald Elder, In the Wake of the News was less a traditional column and more a collection of poems, epigrams, portraits of sports figures, letters, verses, and even verses from contributors. He also added new touches like contests, serials, and parodies. He continued to write the column 7 days a week until 1919. He wrote over 1,600 features for it. It was a syndicated column carried by over 100 newspapers, and this is what really helped make Lardner a household name. In one of the biographies of Lardner, it is said, in 6 years of writing Wake, Ring did his share of inferior work, but overall the quality was so high that the work of those years must be counted among the extraordinary accomplishments of American journalism. Virtually everything upon which Ring's later fame was built originated in the Wake, and in some instances, the Wake version was actually superior to his more celebrated work. He built up a large and loyal audience, and he was read by young would-be writers who imitated him quite often. So you can see here we have some early articles from when he was writing in the wake of the news. The one is from 1913, so right after he took over the column. And then on the right there, it's a comment that was in the Chicago Tribune from June 4th, 1913, just saying that they were happy to see Ring Lardner on that beat, that he was one of the best boys in the business. We know he covered sports in the column, as I said, but he also wrote about other things, including little tidbits about his children and his family life in Riverside in the Chicago area. This column, which is from November of 1916, includes lines such as, B. Larder has learned to pat a cake. And in celebration of All Hallows Eve, the neighbor's children painted a homely picture on our front door Tuesday night and wrote our name under it, the little fiends in human form. So he wrote about a number of topics. Here are a couple more in the wake of the news. The one on the left I really like because it actually is a little poem about Berrien County, and I love that. It says lines such as, by the old brick road to Higman, slightly northward from St. Joe, there's a home-cooked meal awaiting, and it's there I long to go. It goes on to say things like, on the sandy shores of Mish, where they dish delicious fish, and the Pere Marquette is ready to obey your slightest wish, and even take me somewhere north of Sodus, where the best is like the worst, and the statutes of the county say a man must keep his thirst. Things like that, but it talks a lot about our area. And then, as I mentioned earlier, people could contribute to the column, so he didn't write everything for it. And on the right, it's from a 1913 column, but it's about the Battle of Benton Harbor, so a sports game that took place in Benton Harbor, but it was submitted by another writer. So just kind of interesting stuff. While we're talking about in the wake of the news, I wanted to take a moment to highlight the major world event that occurred while Lardner was writing the column, and that is World War I. He covered the war in his column, typically in his usual style of writing. And in 1917, he actually went to France. He went as a reporter for Collier's magazine and for the Tribune, of course. The headlines for when he was over in France during that time were called In the Wake of the War instead of In the Wake of the News. He was never on the front lines, but he did visit Paris. He tried to go to an army camp, and he did get to visit an army hospital where there were US soldiers recovering. Some of the pieces he wrote in France during that time were later included in a book that was titled My 4 Weeks in France. So I was able to find a couple of them. One is from 1917, and it's covering a baseball game between the US and Canadian soldiers. And then on the right, it's in a column from August 30th, 1917, where he tells through a poem about an attempt for him and other reporters to visit a US camp in France. Aside from his journalist or work as a sports writer, he also started publishing other pieces of fiction at this time. Over time, Lardner would become more than just a newspaper reporter. He also wrote short stories, novels, plays, and even songs. We're going to talk about some of those in this next part of the talk. See if this loads. There it goes, takes a second to load. So you can see here, we have a couple articles, or an article and a cover of a song that he wrote. One is a South Bend Tribune article. It's from August 16th, 1910, and it notes one of a piece that he wrote, a song that he wrote. And then the other one is the song Teddy, You're a Bear. That's actually from the museum collection. It was written in 1916, and it was considered the official booster song for Roosevelt during his election campaign. So he wanted to be a songwriter and a playwright really bad. And he had a little bit of success, but not as much as his sports writing was. His most famous song was actually released in 1919, and it still wasn't that popular, but it was called Prohibition Blues. And it was a response to the recently passed 18th Amendment. And the lyrics to the song go, I'm not going to sing it or anything, but you can see I've had news that's bad news about my best pal. His name is Old Man Alcohol, but I call him Al. The doctors say he's dying, as sure as can be. And if that is so, then oh, the difference to me. There won't be no sunshine, no stars, no moon, no laughter, no music, except this one sad tune. Goodbye forever, my old friend Booze. Doggone, I've got the Prohibition Blues. So, another song he wrote. His first book, Bib Ballads, was published in 1915, and it features a number of poems about his children, particularly. We know Lardner and his wife, Ellis, had 4 children. All of them are boys. And several of the poems in Bib Ballads were previously printed in the Wake of the News column. So you can see here we have a poem. This is also, we have a copy of Bib Ballads in the museum collection, but it's a poem, one of the poems from it about what kids are dreaming about, thinking about that and not wanting to wake them up. In 1914, however, Lardner started what would become his most well-known work. While he was traveling with baseball teams for his sports reporting, he came up with the idea for a fictional character named Jack Keefe, a comical baseball busher who tells of his tales coming up in the big leagues through letters written to his longtime friend Al in small town Indiana. The first of this series, which was called A Busher's Letters Home, was published in the Saturday Evening Post on March 7th, 1914. 2 years later, in 1916, the book, You Know Me, Al, featuring the collection of letters, was published. Eventually, Jack Keefe's story would be told in 3 books and a number of short stories. The public loved the Busher letters, and they connected with them immediately, as I've mentioned many times, often because of the language that Ring used. It was authentic American voice, and he was very accurate in how a person in that period of limited education, as this Jack Keefe was, would speak and write. So I've got an excerpt from one of the letters, one of the first ones, where he says, "Well, Al, old pal, I suppose you've seen in the paper where I've been sold to the White Sox. Believe me, Al, it comes as a surprise to me, and I bet it did to all you good old pals down home. You could have knocked me over with a feather when the old man come up to me and says, Jack, I've sold you to the Chicago Americans." The letter goes on to say, he says we aren't getting what you are worth, but I want you to go up to that big league and show those birds that there is a Central League on the map. He says, go and pitch the ball you've been pitching down here, and there won't be nothing to it. He says, all you need is the nerve and Walsh, or no one else won't have nothing on you. So I says I would do the best I could and thanked him for the treatment I got in Terre Haute. They always was good to me here, and though I did more than my share, I always felt that my work was appreciated. I have to note that I had to practice that a couple times when I was preparing for the program, because his writing is not easy to read, especially not easy to read out loud. You kind of have to practice. It's one of the reasons I think that Lardner's pieces are not more well known today. So here's actually the cover of a comic book compilation of the You Know Me, Al series. In 1922, the Bell Syndicate, which was another column that he wrote after Wake of the News, started running the comic strips of his Busher's Letters homes. So this is the cover of that. Lardner went on to publish short stories in several other magazines, including Red Book, McClure's, Metropolitan, Cosmopolitan, and Good Housekeeping. So here is a part of a short story that called The Jade Necklace. It was printed in Hearst International combined with Cosmopolitan in November of 1920. And this is also from the museum collection. But it's interesting because his fictional baseball pieces are really what he became known for. There's this really great book that came out a few years ago called The Lost Journalism of Ring Lardner by Ron Rappaport. And he actually summarizes his fictional baseball pieces and the importance of them in the book. He says, when Lardner's Busher stories were published in the Saturday Evening Post and later collected as You Know Me, Al, they became enormously popular with readers everywhere. But the stories had a larger effect, one that is felt to this day. They established baseball as a fit subject for literary fiction. In the decades that followed Lardner's work, important American novelists would follow Lardner into ballparks and locker rooms and emerge with stories of their own. This all began with Lardner's baseball reporting, and in particular with the fascination with the men who played the game. He wrote about the great stars of the era, of course, Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, but also about the game's characters, the players whose company he enjoyed the most, people like Raleigh Zeider, John Kling, etc. They made repeated appearances in his articles. It's kind of interesting because historians always talk about the 1920s as the golden age of sports and the golden age of sports journalism because of the coverage provided to athletes during that period and those larger than life characters that were portrayed by these journalists. Lardner was really doing that early on, and some even argue he helped create that. So Larder did not stay in Chicago forever. In 1919, he actually left the Tribune and his Wake column. He moved his family out east. He started a weekly column for the Bell Syndicate that ran until 1927. He still covered sports, especially the World Series, but they also covered a number of other topics, including politics, fashion, motion pictures, and of course his other musings. He always got those in there. According to the Rappaport, the guy who wrote The Lost Journalism of Ring Lardner, his syndicated column ran in 150 papers, reached 8 million readers, and made him the single best read columnist of any stripe in the country. So here is part of an article on the World Series. It was part of the Bell Syndicate. This one was actually printed in the Star Press out of Muncie, Indiana on October 6, 1922. Another column is this one here. It's actually a pretty humorous column on golf. It was in the Des Moines Register on January 14th, 1923. It's also a Bell Syndicate column too. The Lardners moved to Connecticut, and then in 1921, when their house was ready, they moved to Great Neck, New York. In Great Neck, we know they lived among many famous people of the era, including Solomon Guggenheim, Vincent Astor, Walter P. Chrysler, Groucho Marx, and of course, F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. They rented a house near the Lardners for a time. And as I mentioned earlier, they became good friends. Apparently, Ring and F. Scott Fitzgerald enjoyed kind of partying together, and the fact that they both were writers. So we have a picture of, this is the Lardner family at their Great Neck home. After he moved out east, he certainly wrote less about sports, but he still covered it. And he expanded his writing career beyond simply newspaper reporting or even that syndicated column. Some say that one of the reasons he stepped away from sports writing was because of the Black Sox Scandal. If you don't know, the Black Sox Scandal was a Major League Baseball game-fixing scandal where 8 members of the White Sox were accused of throwing the 1919 World Series against the Cincinnati Reds, and they received money from a gambling syndicate because of it. 7 members had apparently agreed to throw the series in exchange for $100,000. There was also an 8th player who did not take the money, but knew of the scandal and didn't report it. Word of this scandal did not come out until about a year later. In response, they appointed Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis as the first commissioner of baseball, and he was basically given control over restoring the integrity of the sport. Despite acquittals in public trials in 1921, he permanently banned all 8 men from professional baseball. And this even included later consideration for the Hall of Fame. So we have here, this is in the wake of the news column that is actually about the Black Sox scandal. This would have been after Ring left the column though, so he didn't write it, but you could tell it was obviously big news at the time. Ring himself noted that the Black Sox scandal was one of the reasons he stepped away from writing as much about the sport. But it is known that at the time, the family was already considering their move to New York, and he was in talks with a theater out east to get the exclusive rights to his plays and musicals for a period of 5 years. Actually, the author, Ron Rappaport, who wrote The Journalism of Ring Lardner, he argues that the idea that the scandal disillusioned him is a bit of an exaggeration. He knew that gambling on sports was a thing, and he was not as surprised as everyone thinks he was. In a piece Lardner wrote for the Bell Syndicate on July 17, 1921, called Why Ring Stopped Covering Baseball, he actually blames players like Babe Ruth. So you can see here, oh, this is the Chicago Tribune article about the Black Sox Scandal. It's from 1920. But you can see here, this is from the article he wrote about why he stopped writing about baseball. He said, I got a letter the other day asking why I didn't write about baseball no more, as I used to write about nothing else, you might say. Well, friends, I may as well admit that I kind of lose interest in the old game, or rather it ain't the old game which I have lost interest in it, but it is the game which the magnates has fixed up to please the public with their usual good judgment. Goes on to say, a couple years ago, a ball player named Baby Ruth, that was a pitcher by birth, was made into an outfielder on account of how he could bust them, and he began breaking records for long distance hits and etc. And he become a big drawing card, and the masterminds that controls baseball says so themselves, that if it is home runs that the public wants to see, why leave us? Give them home runs. So they fixed up a ball that if you don't miss it entirely, it'll clear the fence. And the result is that ball players, which used to specialize in humpback liners to the pitcher, is now amongst our leading sluggers, when by rights, they couldn't take a ball in their hands and knock it past the base umpire. Another result is that I stay home and read a book. So it is important to note that he did still cover baseball after that. He covered a lot of World Series events in his syndicated column. And actually, one of his last public collection of fictional baseball writings, called Lose with a Smile, came out in 1933, which was the same year that he died. By 1920, Ring Lardner was one of the highest paid authors in the US. It's interesting to note that although Lardner is known for his baseball stories, only about a third of his 130 short stories were written on the subject. He covered a number of other topics, a few of note. In 1921, he published The Big Town, which is a satire on New York City life, features a man from South Bend, Indiana, who inherits some money and takes his family to New York. He attracted some critical interest in 1924 with a collection called How to Write Short Stories. They included pieces such as Champion and The Golden Honeymoon. In 26, he released another collection called The Love Nests and Other Stories, featured Haircut, Women, and Zone of Quiet. And in 1929, he released another short story collection called Roundup that featured 35 other pieces too. Now, although he was writing short stories and still doing his column and stuff, Ring really wanted to be a great songwriter and a playwright. If you remember, you may have been at the library a few years ago. The Library and History Center partnered on a program, co-hosted a program, and a guy, Scott Topping, he was a professor at SMC and he was a Lardner scholar. He did a program about how Lardner's real passion and interest was in playwriting, and that's really what he wanted to do. He wrote dozens of stage plays. He tried to quit newspaper writing at one point and devote himself to this endeavor. So that's really what he wanted to do. Unfortunately, he was never that successful. Apparently, even that contract he had with the Century Theater for 5 years didn't really produce much. A few great plays that are of note are, in 1928, he co-wrote a play called Elmer the Great. It actually had a Broadway run, and it actually became a movie a little later on too. But the play of his that really caught the most popularity was 1929's June Moon. It's a comedy musical based on a Lardner short story called Some Like Them Cold. And in the play, a character named Fred Stevens journeys to New York City, where he wants to become a famous lyricist. On the way to New York, he meets a dental assistant named Edna Baker. They start a friendship, later evolves to more. He meets another girl when he's in New York. There's some drama, etc. It's a play that's actually still performed today. So you can see here, there's a movie poster for Elmer the Great. And in the middle, it is a review for June Moon. It was in the Pittsburgh Press on October 27th, 1929. And then later, Kirk Douglas actually starred in a rendition of Ring Lardner's script Champion. This was in 1949. It's about a boxer too. So those are just some of the things he really wanted to do, was more of the playwriting. Unfortunately, in the late 1920s, Ring Lardner was diagnosed with tuberculosis. He spent the last years of his life in and out of the hospital. During this time, however, he continued to work, reportedly taking any writing job that he could to ensure money for his family. And he knew how to make money in the writings that would do that. His Bell Syndicate column ended in 1927, and a year later, he started a short column for New York's Morning Telegraph. He also wrote some of the short story collections I mentioned earlier and the plays that we talked about too. This was all during that time. In 1931, he was asked by the Bell Syndicate and the Chicago Tribune News Syndicate to create a new column that were called Night Letters. The column did not last very long. I was actually able to find a few using newspapers.com. And you can see I have them here. One is from 1931. And you can note that it's actually written from Tucson, Arizona, where he wrote it. He was actually staying at a sanitarium there at the time for his health. The other one is from February 24th, 1931, too. So those were just a couple of the short night letters that he wrote later in his life. In 1932, he revived the Busher stories for the Saturday Evening Post. This time they featured a new character, not Jack Keefe, but Danny Warner of Illinois. He played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. He also wrote other pieces for the magazine and some other publications, including a column on radio critiques for the New Yorker. As mentioned earlier, in 1933, he released his last baseball collection called Lose with a Smile. Ring Lardner died at his home in New York on September 25th, 1933. He suffered a heart attack in the morning and he just never regained consciousness. His death was huge news, not only nationally, but of course in his hometown. So you can see here, the Niles Daily Star did a very large article on his death. I actually couldn't scan all of it at once. It was so big. So you can see I just have part of it here. And then the other one is actually a Star Tribune article that talks about how Niles was mourning Lardner after his death. So this article from the Niles Daily Star, they spoke to many community members who knew him and remembered him. They also made special note of how much work he did in the past few years of his life. They mentioned he was in Niles just a month before his death with his 4 sons. They were visiting his sister Lena, and then they went to the Century of Progress Exposition World's Fair in Chicago. They said he returned to Niles often, but he liked to keep pretty quiet and to himself. He was really just there to visit family, but he did bring his family back. It's interesting to note that actually at the time of his death, his sister Lena was working on selling the family home on Bond Street. They were supposed to do an auction with many of the home's interior furnishings at the time, but it was actually pushed off for a while because of his death. So we know, as mentioned, he did return to Niles a lot, and he spoke of the area fondly. He even had a subscription to the Niles Daily Star sent to his home in New York, and he had a membership at Plym Park Golf Course. So I got a couple articles here. One is from the News Palladium in 1923. That's the Benton Harbor paper. And it talks about how he bought a subscription to the golf course, which I think is pretty cool because he would not have been living in Niles when the golf course opened in the 1920s. So he's just supporting his home community. And then his wife was actually from the South Bend area, and that's where they met. So he would come back to visit her family in South Bend. That middle article talks about that. That's a little earlier on. And then they actually even stayed in St. Joe for some summers too. So he did come in and out of the area often. He was cremated and in Queens, New York, but his parents and some siblings are buried at the local Silverbrook Cemetery in Niles. Larder certainly poked fun at small towns in a lot of his writings, and growing up in one, he certainly had experience with them. But I would actually like to share a piece Lardner wrote in one of his friend Harvey letters, which were part of the Wake of the News column. This is from July 14th, 1916, and it's comparing New York to Niles. This was a few years before he moved to New York, but he had recently taken a trip there. So it says, "I can't make it up in my mind which town I like best, New York or Niles, and it is hard to choose between the two of them, on account of them being alike in so many ways. For instance, They both begin with N, and both of them's got a Broadway, and both of them so full of Fords that you're taking your life in your hands when you cross across the street. And both of them's got a big river and lots of factories and a fire department. And New York's close to the Atlantic Ocean, but Niles is even closer to Barren Lake. And New York's across the river from Brooklyn, but Niles is just as bad off on account of being across the state line from South Bend. They each got a theater and some picture shows, but a man gets a square deal in Niles because there's a law against scalping tickets, and you can get into the Opera House for the regular price of 20 cents. Altogether, they ain't hardly any difference between the two towns, and I suppose I might as well have went back to New York, as came here only I happened to look in my pocket yesterday and found $2.35. And if I'm going to spend that much money, why not spend it in Niles, where I got my education? And besides, I found a place here where you get good meals and they don't charge you nothing and act like they wished you would come again instead of looking mean at you because you patronize them. So Niles stayed with Ring Lardner his whole life, and he always had a soft spot for it, in his heart for it. He returned often, bringing his family back here. His sons have even said that the community meant a lot to him. And he wrote about Niles, as evidenced in what I just read, a lot. And a lot of the small towns he created in his works were no doubt inspired by his upbringing. Speaking of his family, I would like to briefly just mention his 4 sons. He had 4, John, James, Ring Jr., and David. All of them took after their father and they worked as writers. John was a newspaper and magazine writer. He specialized in sports. James actually was killed in 1938 while covering the Spanish Civil War for the Herald Tribune. He joined the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. He was killed on one of the last days of fighting. The youngest son, David, was also a reporter, and he was actually killed in a mine explosion during World War II while in Germany working as a war correspondent for the New Yorker. Their other son, Ring Jr., became a famous screenwriter, and he won 2 Oscars. He was also famously known as a member of the Hollywood 10, where he was jailed and actually blacklisted after being accused of being a communist. So he was part of that Hollywood 10 group. In 1985, though, Ring Jr. made a special trip to Niles for the 100th anniversary of his father's birth. At the time, that would have been the only son still living. He visited the old family home on Bond Street, which on the left, I believe that picture is him kind of overlooking by the river there, by the family home. And he hosted a special event at the Niles Library. So that's a picture on the right there at the library. So for this event, according to a Daily Star article from that time, during his visit, Ring Jr. said, "It's nice to know the people of Niles still remember my father. He had a great deal of feeling about his hometown. My father had a soft spot for Niles. I can remember the 1920s out at Long Island. We always got the Niles Daily Star mailed to us. He kept up on the people back here. A great number of stories took place in this kind of setting, and now I know why." Okay, well, as we mentioned earlier, I work at the Niles History Center. The History Center is the Fort St. Joseph Museum and the Chapin Mansion. We are currently open on Thursdays and Fridays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And we do Chapin Mansion tours on Fridays at 1, and admission to the museum is free. And we actually have some exhibits at the museum about Ring Lardner. So I hope everybody can come see us sometime and view the exhibits. And that's all I have for tonight.
We do have a question.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know if any relatives still live locally?
No, not that I know of. The last family member to live in the area was his sister Lena, from what I understand. If someone else knows differently, they can correct me. And she didn't have any children or anything, so none locally. Yeah, I don't know if people have other questions. You want them to just unmute themselves? What works easier for you?
Yeah, I say unmute yourselves if you have
Okay.
any questions. If we don't, then I hope, like I said, I hope everyone enjoyed the talk, and I hope you can come see us at the History Center sometime soon.
Thank you, Molly.
Yep,
Yeah,
thanks, Molly.
yeah.